What's up, you guys? Welcome back to my channel. My name is Danelle Hallan, and I am back with another true crime video. And this is actually part 2 of a 3-part series deep diving into the Starved Rock murders. So if you have not yet seen part 1, make sure to go and check that out first so you will understand absolutely nothing going on in this video. I'll make sure to have that linked down below. Now, before I get into the details of the case, I want to announce with more details than I did before, my new TV show, Gone by Danelle Hallan. Yes, it has a name. It feels super fancy and official. My TV show is now live on the Roku channel Mysteria, or go to channel 548 and watch me break down missing persons cases and shine a spotlight on victims and hopefully get towards answers. Honestly, this is an opportunity that I in my wildest dreams never would have thought would happen, and I would not be here if it were not for each and every single one of you. I am one of only a handful of creators that were chosen to kind of launch something entirely different, something entirely new to hopefully reach more people and help raise awareness even further than I could ever do on this YouTube channel. That is a massive honor that I do not take lightly. And so I just want to make sure you guys know how appreciative I am of you and the fact that it led me to this really awesome opportunity and all of the families that now will have their stories on a much bigger platform, like something massive. It's still mind-boggling to me. There are so many ways that you can watch for free. You can visit therokuchannel.com and search up Mysteria. You can get the Roku channel app on your smart TV, or if you have a Roku stick or would like a Roku stick, you can do that and head to channel 548 on the live TV guide. There are a lot of really, really awesome content creators that are currently on Mysteria alongside myself, and I really think it's something that you guys would enjoy. Now, on to part 2 of the Starved Rock murder series. Now, as a brief recap, just to refresh your brain a little bit, 3 prominent women living in the outskirts of Chicago took a 4-day trip to Starved Rock Lodge in LaSalle County, Illinois. Within hours of arriving, they went missing, and it wasn't noticed until 2 days later. Searches began Wednesday, March 16th, 1960, and by noon, the remains of the women had been found bound, horribly beaten, and placed in a row face up at the mouth of a cave in St. Louis Canyon. Now, initially, this was believed to be a sex crime, especially with the media pouring out headlines and articles warning the public about a sex maniac or possibly multiple sex maniacs out on the loose. But ultimately, the autopsy revealed that none of the women had been sexually assaulted, but they had been beaten to the point of near decapitation. So this crime, for whatever reason it was committed, was incredibly brutal and incredibly personal, it seemed. Months of investigations led authorities to look into every single guest at the lodge, every single employee, local troublemakers, anyone driving down the highway, every single car that was potentially seen there. And so far, all of the leads really seemed to hit dead ends until evidence results from hair samples taken from 2 of the women showed that 2 men, a middle-aged brunette and a blonde teenager, had likely been involved in the murders. As you guys know, when it comes to defensive wounds and defensive actions, one huge thing that authorities look for when they're checking victims for potential evidence is you look for hair in the hands and you scrape underneath the fingernails. And there was such evidence that these women fought against their attacker. And considering this was the 1960s, there was not a lot of really updated forensic technology. DNA testing wasn't a thing yet. These hairs found gripped in the hands of these women were honestly the most promising pieces of evidence that they had so far. But authorities seem to have their eyes on just one man, a dishwasher that had been working in the lodge at the time, 21-year-old Chester Weger. Now, as some background, Chester was born in Iowa in 1939 to Herschel and Juanita Weger. He was one of 5 children, so it was an incredibly busy family life. At the age of 2, he moved to Illinois with his family, and this is where he would remain. Now, growing up, the Weger family was incredibly poor, so they heavily relied on hunting their own meat, foraging, growing their own food. Chester himself participated a lot in this. He spent majority of his time in the outdoors, going throughout all of the woods, and this is something that he had continued to do throughout his young adult life. When Chester was suddenly appearing in the news as a suspect, it was a shock for everyone. First and foremost, he hadn't been named publicly, at least, or really even mentioned as a potential suspect suspect this entire time so far. They had announced through the media that they were looking into different employees at the lodge, but no one really mentioned this dishwasher or the fact that they believed something strange was going on here. And this was also at a time when everything had gone quiet in the case, and it seemed that authorities had hit this brick wall, because just months prior to this, it was accused that the state lab had totally bungled the evidence, and so a lot of people lost hope and faith that this case would be solved, worried that the evidence had been contaminated or that the results were not correct. So right away, authorities started to speak to the media and kind of announce why exactly they had been looking at Chester, and that they'd actually been looking at him since the very beginning of the case. It was revealed in the next few articles that were released that Chester had been questioned numerous times since the murder. I believe it was the 17th, so a day after the bodies were found, that Chester was first questioned. He'd even taken several polygraph tests, I believe 6 of them to be exact up until this point, and he had so far passed every single one until a few more recent tests had been done. But despite the fact that Chester had been questioned a few times and had seemingly passed these different polygraph examinations, authorities also announced that there were multiple other things that kept Chester on their radar. First and foremost, his story apparently changed multiple times, and there were also very large red flags within his history. In this article in 1960, authorities revealed that apart from Chester working at the lodge and being questioned just because everyone else working there was questioned, they had their eye on him due to scratches and bruises they noticed on his face. When authorities initially questioned him about this, because if you remember, they were looking for even random men driving in cars nearby with scratches on their faces, when they questioned Chester about these scratches, he said that he had simply cut his face while shaving. Now, this could potentially be a believable explanation. However, it's also claimed that in other interviews, he changed it up, saying that he had been scratched by a cat. On top of that, Chester had a pretty alarming criminal history. And this criminal history potentially tied into what they originally believed the motive of this triple homicide was. At the age of only 13 or 14 years old, Chester had been charged with sexually assaulting another young girl. According to Chester, he had been walking through his neighborhood one day after school when he heard someone crying in the distance. Now, Chester apparently went to locate where this crying was coming from and ended up stumbling across this young girl that he knew very well, and she was in obvious distress. She told Chester that she had just been sexually assaulted. Chester claimed that he immediately helped this young girl get dressed, that he used a white cloth to help stop the bleeding from the assault, and he took her home. However, despite Chester's claims of finding this young girl and being the one that helped her, he was ultimately the one the finger was pointed at as being the one that sexually assaulted her. And so Chester ended up pleading guilty and was put on probation. Now, ever since this occurred, he has remained adamant that he had nothing to do with the sexual assault on this young girl, and that he had been told to plead guilty, that he knew absolutely nothing of laws, had no understanding of it, and so he did what he thought he was supposed to do. He had also been recently looked into in an assault and robbery on a young couple over in Matheson State Park on September 13th, 1959, so a couple of months prior to the Starved Rock murders. And the incidents are a little similar. Now, not tit for tat, not perfectly, but it is a little bit strange. So a teenage girl and her boyfriend had been taking a walk within Matheson State Park, which, as a reminder, is the park directly beside Starved Rock. It's about 3 miles away. And they were approached by a young man that kind of popped up out of nowhere, and he had a rifle. The young man ordered the girl to use provided twine to tie up her boyfriend. She did as she was asked, and then she ended up being sexually assaulted after this attack. It was reported to the sheriff's department. And according to some claims, Deputy Dummett and Deputy Hess had allegedly ignored the allegations from the girl and her boyfriend. And it doesn't appear that this particular attack was really investigated. And so the teen girl, who was very distraught over what had happened to her and trying to move through the trauma, ended up confiding in one of her teachers, a woman named Sue Osepik, about what had happened. Now, Sue was obviously also devastated that authorities did not seem to be investigating this attack. And then when she saw the Starved Rock murders months later, her stomach dropped because of the similarities. And she decided to personally go to police and remind them about what had happened to this young girl and her boyfriend, worried that this had been the exact same attacker that had just pushed things a little bit further this time. So with this renewed interest in this previous attack nearby and the strange similarities, authorities decided to go back to this young girl and her boyfriend to question them and try to identify who their attacker was. And this was around the time they were narrowing in on Chester. Now, they first showed the young woman a handful of photographs, and within those photographs, as I'm sure you can guess, was a picture of Chester Weger. And sure enough, when this young girl came up to this picture, she picked him out and became very emotional when seeing him. When Chester was confirmed by one of the two victims, they then decided to bring in her boyfriend to try and see if he could pick out their attacker from a lineup. And this lineup consisted of multiple men, again, including Chester Weger. And Chester was picked out. So authorities believed they had quite a few things going against Chester Weger. He was potentially attached to not just this one attack in Matheson State Park, but a second one they were looking into as well. So between this and a few other things that I'd already mentioned in the first video, Chester was kind of high up on the radar at this point. And he had even mentioned to authorities in one of the first times that he had been questioned that he even knew a shortcut out of St. Louis Canyon if authorities thought it might be helpful. And when authorities ultimately took him up on the offer, there was what they believed to be another red flag. First and foremost, he had this knowledge about how to get out of the canyon faster. And that's already something that could potentially be an upper hand for an attacker. On top of that, when he was showing authorities, he briefly paused and looked into one of the caves in the canyon and said, is that where the bodies were found? Had pointed out the exact cave, and authorities found this incredibly unsettling. But despite all of this, Chester maintained his innocence this entire time and remained very cooperative, willingly allowing authorities to take samples off of the jacket he claimed to have been wearing that day. It had a few tassels on it, so they snipped a few off and sent that off for testing. He was even bringing investigators coffee and food and different things because they were working from a portion of the lodge. And this is when things kind of take a bit of a strange turn. Now, we know at this point that evidence taken from the victims, from the brutality of the crime, the fact that it was a triple homicide, strongly suggested more than one person was likely responsible. Being able to subdue 3 women and so brutally attack all of them, dragged them up this 5-foot ledge into the cave. It was a lot of work, a whole lot of effort. So how on earth did all of this lead to 120-pound Chester Weger? This entire time in the news, they had been describing all the potential attackers as husky and all of these different terms, making them seem like these large predators, and Chester just wasn't really fitting into any of those descriptions. It almost seemed like after the bungling of the evidence, when everything started to go quiet and authorities were put into question, people were resigning over this, everyone seemed that much more desperate to solve the murders, or at least be the ones to say that they did, because unfortunately, ego is definitely something that played a part in this case. The residents of LaSalle County were still absolutely terrified of the killer or killers walking amongst them. There was also an election going on at this point, so you better believe that many people were using these murders to try to boot other people from their positions. It was all a part of people's campaigns. So Hallan Warren, the state's attorney at this point, seemed to take matters into his own hands. At this point, most of the evidence in the case had been transferred to the Michigan State Crime Lab, since the Illinois State Crime Lab had allegedly bungled all of the evidence. Well, Hallan Warren apparently went to the Michigan State Crime Lab and took some of this evidence into his possession and began working on his own secret investigation. It even states in articles that he had been secretly working on evidence in this case for months at this point and was described as a, quote, amateur detective and a fan of television murder mysteries and whodunit novels. And interestingly, he was one of those people involved in this election. He was running up against someone else who was heavily using his failures in this investigation to try to have him kicked off the position of state's attorney. So despite the state police doing majority of the legwork in this case, along with the sheriff's department, Hallan Warren stopped informing them entirely about what he was doing, the evidence that he had, pretty much shut down completely, which is absolutely bonkers to me. But also according to articles, while he did seem to be doing his own private investigation, two of his sidekicks were Deputy Dummett and Deputy Hess. They both were working with him on all of this. One of the largest things that Harlan Warren decided to do ended up being the one thing that led, in my opinion, to the conviction of Chester Weger. Harlan Warren brought in polygraph examiners from John Reed and Associates in Chicago. So I'm sure you're asking yourself, why is this important? Why is it important that Harlan Warren brought in different polygraph examiners from John Reed? Now, I'm not sure if any of you remember, but years ago, I covered the murder of Stephanie Crow. And in that particular case, her brother and his two friends, literally 15 years old, ended up confessing to her murder. And they essentially were coerced into confessing using the Reed technique, which was made by, you guessed it, John Reed, based out of Chicago. The young men within the Stephanie Crow case were almost tried as adults at 15 years old and sat in jail for 6 months terrified before DNA evidence actually pointed authorities to someone else entirely. Essentially, the Reed technique is highly controversial because of the accusations that the high-pressure environment it creates seems to draw out false confessions. It's what the Reed technique is known for, especially when it comes to younger adults that can be especially vulnerable or those with mental disabilities, low IQ. The goal of the technique is to essentially break people down psychologically to the point where they confess. And sometimes those that are innocent end up confessing because they don't know what else to do, because they essentially are faced with life and death. And if you don't confess, this will happen. You will die in prison. You will this, that, and the other. And they confess because they're trapped. While many investigators still heavily rely on the Reed technique, it is something commonly used all over the place. It's actually banned in multiple different countries and different locations because of the astonishingly high false confession rate. And so this is definitely something to keep in the back of your mind when you go forward through the rest of this video. And at this point, because they did not have a lot of physical evidence, all of the investigators working on the Starved Rock murder realized that they really needed a confession. Harlan had decided to bring in Chester to receive one of these Reed-administered polygraph examinations, along with a handful of other people. And out of nowhere, after passing 6 polygraph tests, the 7th test, Chester receives inconclusive results. And not just that, after these polygraph examiners questioned him, they came out of the room and said, "That is your guy." So on September 27th, Chester ended up being taken all the way to Chicago by Deputy Dummett and Assistant State's Attorney Craig Armstrong to be questioned by John Reed himself. They wanted, like the man of all men, to sit down with him and get to the bottom of what was happening, and hopefully it would end in a confession. And sure enough, this interrogation went on absolutely forever. They performed polygraph tests, and Reed determined that Chester was lying, that it was very likely he was involved in the murders of Lillian, Francis, and Mildred. For the rest of the day after this, until just around midnight, Chester was repeatedly interrogated by Reed and another associate in an attempt to get this confession out of him. They were using the Reed technique. And when Chester, after all of these hours, refused to budge, was like, "Look, you're asking the wrong person," he ended up being released. Now, despite an entire day of questioning, instead of dropping Chester off at home, they weren't done yet. Assistant State Attorney Craig Armstrong then continued to question Chester for 4 more hours in his office. It was in the midst of these 4 hours of questioning that Chester ended up agreeing to be a part of the lineup that would ultimately point him out as the attacker in Matheson State Park in September of 1959. After almost 24 hours straight of questioning and polygraph examinations, Assistant State Attorney Craig Armstrong and Deputy Hess then took Chester back to his apartment, where they ordered him to get his buckskin jacket that he had been wearing the day of the murders. As I had stated, they'd already taken some samples of tassels off of it, but this time they wanted to look at the entire thing. Chester brought it to them to be sent off to the lab, and then finally he was released. In the media the following days, it was revealed that while Chester had been questioned during all of that time, he had been confronted about a letter that state police had found on the trail leading to the canyon in the weeks after the murders. And this seemed to be one of the smoking gun pieces of evidence that Harlan Warren was heavily focusing on and had been really keeping to himself, believing it would be the one thing that tied Chester to the location of the crime. Chester's alibi this entire time so far was that he had been in the basement of the lodge in the powwow room writing letters to this lover of his. And the letter found on the trail leading to the area where the women had been murdered appeared to be a torn up letter potentially written by Chester Weger. And it was dated to March 14th, 1960. The day of the murders. And essentially this letter appeared to be Chester confessing his love to this woman. Now, upon finding this letter, authorities began working with the local postal offices and managed to find that Chester had sent a second letter on the 15th, so the following day. And in this letter, there seemed to be a drastic change. In the second one, he suddenly spoke of leaving the area entirely, of quitting his job, re-enlisting in the Marines. He actually stated he had already re-enlisted in the Marines. He'd be going out to California. And so both of these letters were sent off for handwriting analysis, and it was a match. These were in fact written by Chester Weger. And so I'm sure that these letters were used during the interrogations to hopefully again get a confession out of Chester to say, hey, look, we've got proof here. You were by the canyons. We have a date on the letter that you wrote. It's confirmed to be written by you. But Chester said, nope, you have all of this wrong. Chester claimed that he had in fact torn up a letter on the trail leading to the canyon. But he said that he did it back in February. Chester claimed that he frequently took walks in this park on his breaks. If you remember what I mentioned about his background, that he spent a lot of time in the woods, a lot of time just outdoors in general, it was a way for him to clear his head, get some fresh air, so it wouldn't be abnormal to find signs of him throughout the park, especially in these very popular canyons. Authorities did not see it this way. This letter was dated and it placed Chester at the canyon. So it was decided that at this point, Chester would be put on 24/7 surveillance. Now, with all of this new information coming out, reporters ended up flocking to Chester's home to question him, obviously. And he repeatedly denied to reporters any involvement in the crime and was even able to explain away why he had inconclusive or failed test results for the polygraph, saying, quote, I wiggled my arm to loosen a strap they put above my elbow. So essentially he was saying that they had placed things weird on him during this polygraph, and so he was moving around to try to get comfortable, and that was what caused it to be inconclusive, not the fact that he had been lying. For a month, Chester was trailed nonstop, and he was well aware of it. It was not like authorities were trying to hide it. It was being plastered all over the papers, so I'm not exactly sure what they thought they were going to find since he knew they were there. And Chester's behavior during this time really wasn't helping his case at all. Chester went hunting a lot, coon hunting, squirrel hunting, again, one of those things that he carried on from childhood. And apparently when he would go hunting, he would get so sick of these people following him that he would point his gun towards the officer and pretend to shoot. He was constantly making faces at those that were following him, mocking these men for trailing him, making them, honestly, probably that much more eager to catch him doing something off. While Chester was being followed to kind of check up on this evidence that Harlan Warren believed so strongly pointed at him, Harlan Warren, that early November of 1960, ended up being defeated in the election, and former FBI agent Robert Richardson ended up taking his place. So there's all this change happening, and one of the large reasons Harlan Warren did not get reelected had to do with the way that he handled the Starved Rock murder cases, and Robert Richardson had made lots of different promises. Promised to bring back the collaborative efforts between all agencies, since Harlan seemed to want to play detective and take over the case himself. But right after this, articles slammed the headlines, suddenly speaking of a confession. On November 16th at 6 p.m., Chester Weger was picked up by Deputy Dummett and Deputy Hess to be questioned yet again. 4 hours, Chester still maintained his innocence, just as he had always done. And out of nowhere, Sheriff Utsi, despite this, decided, you know what, enough is enough. Even though you are denying everything, we feel we have enough to arrest you. Typically at this point, all of the evidence that they had to suggest Chester was responsible would be brought before a judge and a warrant would be obtained. However, for some reason that's never been explained, Sheriff Utsi instead went to a justice of the peace, which anyone can really be a justice of the peace. For example, this man was a grocer, and this is where they obtained an arrest warrant for Chester Weger. Now, this is kind of problematic because typically with federal cases, it needs to be a judge. You can't just go to a justice of the peace, but I don't know if that's like absolutely set in stone. I don't have enough knowledge when it comes to that, but regardless, Chester ended up being confronted once they were able to kind of get this warrant with all of the alleged evidence that they had against him. They questioned multiple different employees at this point who had confirmed that Chester had scratches on his face. The days after the murders, they had the twine around the woman's hands matching twine found in the lodge. The jacket they had taken from Chester had been sent off to FBI labs, and it was confirmed that he had blood on his jacket, and that blood was human blood. And also he had been identified in similar crimes all within the areas of these parks, Matheson State Park and Starved Rock. But despite throwing all of this information at Chester, he still was not cracking. And so the interrogation continued. And while they had what they need to arrest him, they had obtained a warrant, it seemed they still really wanted a confession from him. Likely because they had no physical evidence really, at least nothing to absolutely point at Chester as being responsible for the crimes. So his wife and parents were essentially brought in to plead with him to tell the truth. And so they arrived at around 1 in the morning. And after briefly speaking with all of them at 1:45 a.m., Chester confessed to killing Frances Murphy, Lillian Oding, and Mildred Lindquist. This is what Chester Weger confessed had actually happened on the day of the murder. Chester said that the morning of Monday the 14th, 1960, he had received a ride to work that day from a coworker because he at the time did not own a car. He performed his normal morning duties as a busboy at the lodge, which included cleaning up after the guests' breakfast and lunch, and at around 2:45 he had a bit of a break. So he told authorities that he decided to take a walk using the Bluff Trail towards St. Louis Canyon. Quote, "I was taking a walk through the woods when I turned into the canyon and I spotted them coming toward me. I got the idea to rob them. I grabbed at what I thought was a purse one of the women was carrying. The strap broke." It turned out that Chester had not grabbed a purse like he had initially thought, but instead he had accidentally grabbed the strap for a pair of binoculars. The pair of binoculars that were ultimately found at the scene, broken in half and bloody. Now, the women, according to Chester, immediately jumped in response to defend themselves. Miss Oding and Miss Murphy began to repeatedly try to hit Chester with the pair of binoculars. He said that he was hit by something sharp, which he later said was potentially a comb, and their hopes were to scare him off and get him to leave them alone. Now, realizing what he had done, that he had attempted to rob these women, he realized very quickly that they were now going to be able to identify him. So Chester claimed at this point he basically had to clean up after his own mess. He somehow convinced the women that he was not going to hurt them, and then somehow got them all to willingly agree to walk to the back of the canyon where they would now be essentially trapped. There was no escape in this box canyon, one way in, one way out, and they agreed to go in there with Chester. Now, he claimed that one of the women, Miss Lindquist, kept comparing him to her own son and saying things like, "Oh, I don't believe that he would hurt us. I think he's telling the truth. He reminds me so much of my son." And another woman apparently continued to say that her husband was in the police force and Chester would never get away with what he was doing. After he somehow miraculously convinced the women to put themselves in a much scarier position in the back of the canyon, he took it a step further and again convinced the women to now let him tie them up. He explained to them that he needed to tie them up so that he could get away faster without them trailing him, that they would be able to identify him. And somehow, I guess they agreed to this as well. He even explained to authorities that he had tied the women up in a way that it wouldn't cut off their circulation and harm them. And he, I guess, reassured the women that someone would eventually come down into the canyon and cut them free and no harm would come to them. While they did apparently agree to this, Miss Murphy eventually broke free after being tied up and again went after Chester. Quote, I tied them so they wouldn't follow me. The little one, Miss Murphy, raised her hand to hit me. When I started back, she came after me on the path. I thought she was tied. She hit me on the back of the head with binoculars. I reached for the club as she hit me, and I turned and struck her on the back of the head. Now, from the way this is worded, it appears that he had started off down the trail, that he was out of the canyon, walking down the trail when Miss Murphy came up out of nowhere and attacked him. And so he found this nearby branch, the one that was ultimately found by authorities and claimed to be the murder weapon, and proceeded to hit her with it. And at this point, Chester said he thought that he had killed her. Quote, her eyes were closed. I carried her back to the cave. The two women in the cave managed to get up. One tried to scratch me. I don't know which one. I'd laid the club down, but I picked it up and hit them so they couldn't identify me. They lay back. I kept striking them. Then I looked up and Miss Murphy came too. I thought I had killed her. I thought she was dead. Chester had apparently killed the other two women, Lillian and Mildred, thinking that he had killed Miss Murphy, when in reality, he had only knocked her unconscious temporarily. So at this point, he believed he had no choice but to finish what he had started. During Miss Murphy's final fight for her life, she managed to hit Chester one more time with the binoculars, cutting his chin, explaining the cut that was there, the bruises that were there. And then after killing all three women outside of the cave, Chester explained that to make sure they were dead, he checked their pulse so that one of them would not suddenly pop up again and come after him. And as he was doing this and realized he had actually killed all three women, suddenly he noticed a red and white plane circling above. Right away, he was worried that this was maybe a police plane, or at the very least, whoever was flying above would look down. It's winter, none of the leaves are out, and they would very clearly see Chester in this bloody crime scene with these three women. And so he began to drag the women into the cave and hide them from aerial view. Quote, then I took this here lady's coat off, if I'm not mistaken, and put it in front of this one here and just made it look like a rape. Is all I can say. So he essentially is saying that he staged it to look like something it was not. Now, I personally, this is probably what stuck out to me the most. His history so far, at least what he had been convicted of so far, was sexual in nature. So I'm not sure why someone with a history of sexual assault would take a crime and manipulate it to look like something they'd already been proven capable of doing. To me, that doesn't make a lot of sense, but a lot of this confession doesn't make sense, in my opinion, and we will get into that. But regardless, he claimed that at this point, he decided to go and clean himself off. He said that he used the snow to clean off his hands and his pants before returning back to the lodge to continue working. Somehow, with nobody noticing that he had just committed a triple homicide. Chester proceeded to tell authorities that the real motive in this crime was robbery, but nothing had actually been taken. So Chester was asked, why didn't you take anything? If motive was the robbery and it wasn't sexual assault, and you just set it up to look that way, what happened here? Because the women all still had, their expensive jewelry on them. And Chester said that he didn't take anything because he knew it would lead straight back to him. That once he had killed the women, he did in fact check them for cash, things that would be immediately beneficial to him. And when he didn't find any, he realized he was left with jewelry alone. And in order to get money from that jewelry, he would have to pawn the jewelry off. And he knew that was going to leave a paper trail, or at least some trail that would lead directly back to him, which he wasn't really wrong. When it was initially thought that Miss Oding's rings were gone, when they almost for a moment changed the motive to robbery, authorities had in fact gone to every single pawn shop in the area to see if the jewelry had been sold somewhere. Now, as you guys know, if you watched the first video, those rings were ultimately found on Miss Oding, so nothing at all was stolen. So after this confession, Chester Weger was arrested and charged with the murders of the three women, along with two other attacks that had occurred at Matheson State Park. And he was taken to jail, where he would be in solitary confinement and under 24-hour guard. But this didn't last for long, because authorities wanted more than just a confession. After only 4 hours had passed since Chester Weger had confessed, he was again whisked away and asked to do a reenactment of the crime at the actual crime scene. And he did just that. Dozens of law enforcement were watching, as well as the media taking photographs and taking videos as Chester acted out the entirety of the crime from start to finish. He pretended to tie together authorities' wrists as if they were the women, showing how he had tied them, the knots that he had used. He showed where he had placed the women in the cave, every single detail. He spoke about tying Miss Murphy on her own, and then spoke of tying both the hands and the feet of Miss Oding and Miss Lindquist before tying the two women together. Everything, for the most part, seemed to line up. Not only the details of his confession and the reenactment, but they'd even been able to confirm this plane that he saw overhead. Then, the next 24 hours, Chester confessed, I believe, a total of 4 times to 9 separate people. Sheriff Utsi stating publicly, quote, "The subject shows no attitude of remorse. He seems very matter-of-fact and completely devoid of emotion." But by November 19th, less than 48 hours after his initial confession and 24 hours after he was indicted, he recants. Chester was now claiming, after all of this, that he had absolutely no knowledge of the murders whatsoever, and he was not involved. They didn't have the right person. I have very mixed feelings about recanted confessions just because it's like sometimes they recant because they're like, dang, I probably should not have admitted that. I don't want that to end up at trial. But then you have a situation like this where there is the Reed technique involved, which is kind of known for pulling false confessions out. And so it's just really difficult when something like this happens. And so at this point, journalists spoke with his family, who were now stating that they had a feeling this entire time that he had been shielding someone, that there was something more that was going on beneath the surface. And so they were going to do all that they could to try and get to the bottom of who is actually responsible. And at this point, they were saying to the media that they were going to try to convince Chester to take a truth serum, hoping that this would show that he was innocent. And Chester had also come forward saying, quote, "Now there's nothing in the world that I needed bad enough to kill for on March 14th, 1960. I had no reason to rob anyone, and before I'd try to beat a murder rap, which happened over an alleged purse snatching, I'd try to rob a bank." But not only did Chester recant his confession, on November 22nd, just a few days later, he straight out said that it was coerced. Chester claimed that he was offered a deal of life in prison if he made it easy and confessed, and that if he did not confess, that they would do whatever it took to convict him and ensure that he received the electric chair. So he said that to save himself from what he believed was imminent death, he did what he felt he had to. Which that does hang me up just a bit, because it's not the first time that he had stated something like that. He claimed that he had been fed information about the crime by the detectives, that they had shown him multiple photos of the crime scene, of the women. He had been questioned at this point so many times, and on top of that, it had just been relentlessly posted all over the news, every detail about what was going on, pretty much all of the investigative efforts. And so he said that this is how he was able to put everything together, enough for a confession. And then when it came to explaining how on earth he, on top of that, was able to do an entire reenactment of the crime that, from my understanding, was pretty accurate to exactly how the woman had been found. He claimed that he had been coached for 30 minutes prior to this reenactment to ensure that he got it right. Quote, "Dummett and Hess told me where each woman was found. There isn't a thing in that statement that could have happened as I said. I thought they could see that, but all they wanted was a conviction, and now they're happy. I signed those statements because I figured that's the only way to save my neck. I knew of Bill Dummett's words of how he'd send me to the chair. I thought of everything I knew that happened, and I pieced it together into a story." He even went on to claim that 2 men had threatened his entire family, and this was another reason that he decided to confess, something that was backed up by a handful of other people that had spoken to Chester, where he in his own way seemed to say that, yeah, I had people threatening me. And he claimed that these were potentially the people that were actually responsible for the murders. And not just that, not just the confession and then recanting a confession and then claiming it was coerced. He also suddenly wanted to entirely change his alibi as well. And I will state, this is not the first time that he ended up doing this. Chester was now claiming, along with his family, that he had not been in the lodge at the time of the murders, writing these letters. He'd been telling people for months at this point, but he was actually in Oglesby, which is a nearby town, at a restaurant. Authorities were questioned about this to see if they had checked into this new alibi. They admitted that they actually hadn't looked into it, that they had not gone to the restaurant owners. They had not confirmed in any way, shape, or form if he had been there, but they said it's because they felt they had enough evidence to show otherwise at this point. And even Chester's own attorney at the time says in an article that he personally had gone to the restaurant to try and have someone corroborate this alibi, but that the owners couldn't say for sure the day and time Chester had come into the restaurant. So despite having this new alibi, there still was nobody to back Chester on what he was saying. And I will say that this kind of gets to me. When it comes to a recanted confession and claims of coercion, I can totally see this just because of what I know of the Reed technique. Things kind of seem a little bit strangely timed, in my opinion, as well. And so I can see the claims that he had been pushed into confessing. People were desperate to nail someone for this crime. And when you look at what they were claiming happened, that there was more than one person, they even have these two different types of hair entirely supporting the fact that there's two people, and then they kind of narrow in on one person. It felt off. But changing the alibi, I find very interesting, especially because one of the largest pieces of evidence Harlan Warren was kind of bringing forward was this torn up note that was found dated to the day of the murders. Now all of a sudden he's saying, oh no, I actually wasn't writing letters at all. I was in a completely different town. I don't know how to feel about it, because this had been the same alibi he'd been using for months at this time, and all of the numerous different interrogations and polygraph tests, and now all of a sudden it's different. Let me know how you feel about it. Authorities also strongly disagreed with the allegations of a coerced confession, stating that no such threat or promise was made at all in return for his confession. They also claimed that there wasn't even any way that this confession could have happened under any type of duress, that they had a doctor come and check him immediately after his confession to ensure that he was physically and mentally sound. He had been fed, he had been given water, he was not deprived of anything. During the interrogation where he confessed, he had only been questioned for a handful of hours. So it wasn't like he'd been kept up at this point for 24, 48 hours like some of the other times. He seemed to willingly confess this information. And watching the articles around this time feels like watching a tennis match. It is just back and forth, back and forth. One article where Chester's making claims, another one where authorities are defending themselves, but everyone knew that in reality, only time and a jury would tell. On December 19th, 1960, Chester Weger pleaded not guilty, and on February 13th, 1961, the trial began. However, it was only for the murder of Lillian Oding, with the others to eventually follow. And the reason why, in my opinion, is completely understandable, and you see it very often. It's nothing strange, but in this case, in particular, I feel like it could also potentially be very telling. Attorney Richardson and assistant attorney Anthony Raculia, he was a 27-year-old, never tried a murder case before, fresh out of school. They made the joint decision to prosecute the murders one at a time. In large part because of their flimsy evidence. There was no physical evidence at all really tying Chester to the crimes. And also they had this confession that in reality didn't make a whole lot of sense. Raculia even stated decades later, quote, "I read that confession one night as we were preparing this case. I said, Bob, this can't have happened this way. This is absolutely ridiculous to have happened this way." He said, "Well, what are you going to do about it?" I said, "Well, nothing. I'm going to tell the jury this is what happened." Because bottom line, at the end of the confession, he says, "I killed him." It was a risk because without the confession, all we really had was the spattered jacket and the circumstances of the scratches. The prosecution was hoping that if anything did not go the way that they had hoped and planned in this trial, that they would be able to push forward with the next victim and try again. And if that didn't work, they would have one more. They essentially wanted as many opportunities as possible to ensure that they were able to put this potential murderer behind bars for the rest of his life or sentence him to death. Now, during the preliminary hearings, Chester and many witnesses took the stand. Chester's attorney, John McNamara, who was actually the second attorney that was hired to work for him, hoped to have the confessions entirely thrown out. I mean, they just decided to reach for the stars. The defense was supporting Chester's claims that this confession was in fact coerced, stating that Deputy Dummett himself had essentially constructed this entire elaborate confession and that Chester simply repeated it. Chester even made claims that on the ride back from Chicago, Dummett had told him he would, quote, ride a thunderbolt. Amongst multiple other things, there were accusations thrown out by Chester that Dummett had placed a gun to his back or put a gun to his head and would pull the trigger just to scare him, that he had nightsticks shoved into his stomach, that he was essentially threatened multiple times to get these confessions out of him. Now, under cross-examination, Chester agreed that up until those last two polygraph examinations done through using the Reed technique and the different agency, that he had not one time been threatened, he wasn't physically harmed, that he had been very cooperative, he had a good relationship with detectives, he'd never been withheld food or water or anything like that, but once he received these Reed polygraphs, everything went downhill. And so the prosecution used this to say, hey, look, like he was not coerced. They just had enough evidence. They finally had enough to back him into a corner and he ended up confessing and now he's mad about it. The prosecution was also able to bring forward other witnesses that completely contradicted these allegations from Chester, saying that they had been present at many of these different interrogations and there were never any threats to their knowledge that had been made to Chester, including Dummett himself, who took the stand and said, I never told Chester he was going to ride a thunderbolt. I never threatened him at all. And he repeated this numerous times on the stand. However, one small win that the defense had was with Assistant State Attorney Craig Armstrong, who had been in the car with Dummett and with Chester on that ride back from Chicago when Chester claimed that Deputy Dummett threatened that he was going to ride a thunderbolt. Despite the fact that Dummett repeatedly on the stand denied ever saying this, Armstrong said it did in fact happen. Deputy Dummett actually threatened Chester with this at least 5 times during the entire car ride. In the same breath, Armstrong said that no promises of leniency were ever made. It didn't seem like a threat to him. He didn't really understand what exactly Dummett meant initially by you're going to ride a thunderbolt until Chester responded saying that he wasn't going to get the electric chair because he had done nothing wrong. He didn't kill anyone. And in that moment, he realized Dummett had been speaking to Chester about the death penalty. So let's just take a moment to simmer in the fact that Dummett had lied on the stand. He had perjured himself. Like, this is quite literally proven by someone who had been in the car with him and essentially kind of testified against him. But somehow, nothing was done about it. So the witnesses kept rolling in support of the prosecution. Many other witnesses saying that Chester spoke about wanting to confess numerous times prior to his original confession and that he simply had chickened out. And so ultimately it was determined by Judge Leonard Hoffman that the confessions would be used in the trial, saying, quote, the defendant knew what he was doing. So when the trial began, the defense mainly continued to focus on trying to prove that these confessions were coerced and try to dismantle them in whatever way that they possibly could. The prosecution had buttoned up tight, and I believe they had over 65 witnesses to support their claims that Chester was guilty. Witnesses were called to the stand to testify about the scratches seen on Chester's face and his behavior in the days following the crime, because this was one of the main pieces of evidence they had to support Chester's guilt. A lodge janitor ended up testifying that he saw Chester the day after the murders and noticed these scratches and had even jokingly said to Chester, what kind of tomcat did you get in a tangle with? And it seemed like the entire lodge and people that worked with Chester had been poking fun at him about these scratches on his face. Because at this point, no one really knew the women were missing and connected to anything but a potential attack. Miss Reeves, a dishwasher, had also testified to seeing the scratches on the 15th, so the day after the murder, but she didn't speak about these scratches or seeing them until October 11th. And when questioned about this, she said that she had been told by management at the lodge to stay out of the investigation. Essentially, the entire staff had been told to be quiet, let authorities do their job, and not mention a thing, which is interesting in my opinion. A handful of other kitchen workers also claimed the exact same thing. I'm not going to get into every single one. And then even head chef Glenn Kamadi, I believe that's how you pronounce his last name, confirmed the twine that was used in the kitchen looked very similar to the twine found on the women. While I haven't seen every single document, every single paper from every single witness, a lot of the ones that I have seen support this idea that these people all suddenly started coming forward early October, which was around the time that these different polygraph examiners were brought in and eyes focused on Chester. I find very interesting because it even claims in the article where these scratches are first mentioned that authorities claimed they had known about these scratches since the very beginning of the investigation. Maybe they had seen them themselves. Maybe they went back and later questioned these employees about them, knowing that they needed someone else to confirm those scratches were there. However, I've also not seen any notes from anyone. I wish I could, of any of the original investigators where they had written down some sort of evidence where they had in those first few days seen these cuts on Chester, since they did in fact question him on the 17th for the very first time. And this was all brought up in cross-examination. Chef Glenn Kamadi, who had testified about the twine and seeing the scratches, was put face to face with one of the times that he had been questioned by authorities in early October. And this is what his response was when he was questioned about the cuts. Quote, "What is this? The scratches that everybody is talking about? I didn't notice them. The remark was made by one of us. He said it was a close shave. I never saw the scratches." So despite the fact that he had gone on the stand and testified to seeing them, in this other interview, he's saying he had absolutely no idea what this hubbub was about the cuts. And it seems like he's saying that in early October, all of a sudden, everyone was talking about these cuts that had been on Chester's face after the murder. And so it seemed to really throw the idea of these scratches on Chester's face into question. And while the defense was in fact able to bring forward 10 witnesses that claimed they didn't see the scratches on Chester, under their cross-examination, it was pretty much found that they probably didn't see them because they were either too far away or they had like visual impairments and needed glasses or something of the sorts. So it kind of left these scratches hanging up in the air. Herschel Weger, Chester's father, was also brought to the stand in regards to these threats that allegedly been made to Chester about getting the electric chair. And he said that he had arrived to speak to his son in the early morning hours of the 17th, just before he had confessed. And that when he arrived, Sheriff Utzi first told him that if Chester didn't confess, he was going to, quote, "the little green room," which Herschel said he knew of as the execution chair chamber. I don't really know how else to word that. And so when he heard this, he took this as a threat that, hey, your son's going to get the electric chair. He said that this terrified him. And when he went in to see his son and asked him, hey, did you commit these murders? That Chester said, no, I didn't. And so after speaking to his son, Herschel said that he was so upset and he was so sure Chester was not involved that he actually went to Sheriff Utzi himself and said, look, you've got to postpone these interrogations until tomorrow at the very least so that I can obtain a lawyer and get my son some sort of legal advice to help him navigate the situation. But clearly, if what he is saying is truth, that never happened because they still went in immediately afterwards and questioned Chester, which ultimately led to a confession. The prosecution also brought forward their own experts when it came to the confession and the validity of it. Dr. Kruglich, again, I hope I'm pronouncing that right, was a psychiatric consultant that testified, and he had apparently spoken to Chester within hours of the original confession, and he claimed that Chester basically felt like he had taken a breath of fresh air after this, that he said that he had been having relentless nightmares ever since he committed the murders, that he was having nightmares about people breaking into his home and trying to get to him and all of these different things, and that after confessing, he slept for the first time in a very long time. He even repeated this entire confession to Dr. Kruglich, and the doctor said, quote, he was concerned about his mother's health and thought it was best to tell all about the case and let the court decide on his punishment. Essentially, it seemed he was saying that Chester felt like he had been running from this for so long. He was worried about how it was affecting his family, and so he finally said, enough is enough, I'm going to confess. But just like the scratches, when it came to physical evidence, honestly, everything seemed a bit weak. FBI Special Agent Rene Bedez testified that when he was sent this buckskin jacket, when authorities sent more than just the sample and just sent the whole dang thing off, that he found pretty quickly splatters of blood that he described as ranging from the size of a pinpoint to spots as large as a straight pen. So there was definitely blood on this jacket. It was like down the sleeve and the chest area, but it was like very minute is how they were described, minute spots of blood. And this blood was in fact human. And so there were spots, I believe, like down one of his sleeves and on his chest. I don't have the whole report to be able to say every single spot it was found, but all of these spots were tiny. It was described as being minute spots of blood. And so during cross-examination, it was found that while this blood was in fact found to be human, which by the way, a whole other can of worms is that for months it was claimed that the test results said that it was animal blood. Regardless, there was such a small amount of blood that they could not even type it to see if it matched the women or if it matched Chester. So this, personally, the moment I heard this, just since it's one of the most important pieces of evidence within this case in terms of linking him to the murders, they believe that he got blood on his jacket while attacking these women. All I can think about is the horrific brutality of the crime. This was not a shooting where you can stay far away, potentially not get blood on yourself. This was a hands-on triple homicide using a handheld weapon. And it was said that these women had like 100+ blows to their heads. They were unrecognizable. They were almost decapitated. And so to me, again, I'm not an expert, but I just feel like you would see much more blood than that on someone. And that just also makes me really think about the fact that he somehow did all this and claimed that he washed his hands off and his pants off using snow in the area, which it's also said in articles there was barely any snow on the ground, and then went to work and no one noticed anything. So these people may have seen scratches and bruises on his face, but no one noticed that the clothing he had been wearing he, killed 3 women in. It just seems super odd to me, but maybe he had a change of clothes. Maybe there is a way to explain it, but I just don't have access to that information. But when you look at it for what it is, the prosecution saying, hey, he killed these women in this jacket, that's why there's blood there. To me, 1 + 1 does not equal 2. Another expert also testified in regards to the alleged murder weapon, which is, in my opinion, just another very shaky piece of evidence. While it was stated that this was the murder weapon from the get-go, we also have the kind of bizarre results from the state lab, which is not necessarily trustworthy, saying that this piece of wood was too rotted. However, Dr. Francis Kukacha, again, another name that I really hope I am pronouncing right, basically supported the fact that this was the murder weapon. Now, Dr. Kukacha was a chemist and testified that upon examining this piece of wood from the branch and the small pieces of wood that had been found embedded in Miss Oding's skull, that they both came from white oak. It was their professional opinion that these two woods matched. Quote, I am convinced the small particle of wood chip came from the thicker end of the limb. But out of all of the different witnesses, probably one of the most damning, at least according to the articles that were posted about the trial, was from a guard that had been looking over Weger while he was in jail. This guard ended up taking the stand and stated that on November 23rd, as he was awaiting trial, Chester said, quote, I made 2 mistakes. I took the lie detector tests in Chicago, and I went out to Starved Rock and put all the pieces together for the dumb cops. And finally, on February 27th, 1961, Chester took the stand himself. Chester began to tell the jury his version of events of what had actually happened, and obviously it does not at all line up with these confessions that he said were coerced from him. Chester told the jury that he had been picked up by a chef that morning, one of his co-workers, to be brought to the lodge for his shift. He said that he worked in the kitchen that morning. Again, he was a busboy, and so he took care of all of the dishes from breakfast, and that on Mondays, he actually ended up also taking over the duties of another employee that I guess didn't work Mondays. And so this had him working straight through into the lunch shift. Chester said that it was around 3 o'clock that he finished cleaning up lunch. He went back to his alibi that he had been writing letters. So we had the strange alibi shift that he was potentially at a restaurant, and now we're going back to the fact that he was writing the letters. He said that he had to get a piece of paper and pencil and a stamp from the front desk of the lodge, but he could not recall who had given that to him, and that he then went down to the powwow room at the basement of the lodge where he plugged in that jukebox, wrote a letter, and he said he refilled the stoker and then played pinball until around 4:30, and he was due for his dinner shift at around 5 p.m. So At 4:30, he decided to go and freshen up, and this is when he claims he went into a bathroom of the lodge and shaved. And this is when he cut his face. He said after this, he also ended up hitting his face on a towel cabinet, which could also explain the bruise that he had. In their resting arguments, McNamara said that he believed in Chester Weger and said that, quote, Dummett and Hess, the inseparable twins, bullied and promised to save Weger's life if he signed the confession, a confession they took from this young American citizen by trampling on his rights. Every word of that confession shows it was a cunningly devised lie, a lie first mouthed by William Dummett, after which he offered Chester Weger his life if Chester would confess according to his theory. While the prosecution stated, quote, I have worked with the men who have been vilified and called liars by the defense in this trial, and this is the picture you will take with you to your deliberations. These men and the others who worked so many long hours to solve the Starved Rock case, if they wanted to make a patsy out of Weger, as the defense would have you believe, they could have done it earlier. And after 9 hours and 40 minutes of deliberation, on Chester Weger's 22nd birthday, the jury found Chester guilty of the murder of Lillian Oding, and he was sentenced to life in prison with the possibility of parole in 1972. While the prosecution and the women's families did not receive the death penalty as they had been hoping this entire time, there was at least still some justice. This was over. The town finally felt safe. The hundreds of people that had packed into the courtroom on a daily basis or just settled with waiting outside for any details all took a breath of relief. And it was also announced at this point that the prosecution was hoping there would be no more trials. They did not want the families to have to sit through any more trials, any more of this pain, reliving all of this, seeing these awful photographs of their mothers, of their wives, of their friends, of their sisters, the way that their bodies had been found. This had a toll on so many people, and everyone just wanted it to be over. However, after all of this, within this madness and this sigh of relief and this mixture of people in the community that believed they finally had justice and those that felt something was off, it became apparent right away that there had been issues within the jury. Honestly, being such a massive case, this is not at all surprising. Differences in opinions and controversies are not unexpected. You're never going to get people to feel the same way about a case, no matter what, no matter how blaringly obvious it might be to you that it's one way. Some people are going to believe it is the other. But when you see this coming directly from the jury, that's a little bit different. In many articles following this conviction and sentencing, the jury almost immediately all spoke out, saying that they had absolutely no idea that Chester would be able to get parole so quickly. They thought that he had no opportunity at parole whatsoever, and that they basically had chosen the only option they could, and life in prison meant just that. Life in prison. So their understanding of the sentencing and the conviction that they had passed down was thrown into question. And then it was like, why did no one explain that to them? One juror, Nancy Porter, stated, quote, we thought we were inflicting a penalty worse than the electric chairs. But not just this, apparently the jurors were not all on the same page for the entire time they were deliberating. Nancy Porter also came forward stating that she had been holding out, saying years later, quote, I was the holdout. Everyone else wanted to go home, and I finally said, oh, okay. I didn't change my mind, but I was getting pretty dirty looks, so I gave in. I've been sorry ever since. She said that the entire time she was not at all convinced that this confession made any bit of sense, that it all seemed scrambled and weird and off and did not match up to the way things would have logically gone, and she only conceded to his conviction 90 minutes prior to the actual announcement. Harry Herman, another juror, also ended up coming forward saying that it was obvious to him that majority of the jury did want him locked up, did want him sentenced to death, but he was so terrified that they had chosen wrong. But even more alarming, he was claiming that the jury was pressured to make the conviction, to hand down the electric chair, that it was made very clear to him that was what was expected of them by the investigating authorities. Quote, the deputies pressured us by telling us what they would do if they were on the jury. One of them said we ought to have seen the women out in the canyon. Another deputy even threatened to perjure a juror with tape recordings. I don't even know how they could have any recordings, though. No one is supposed supposed to have a microphone in the jury room and the quarters. And this came out immediately after the conviction and sentencing. This wasn't something where they sat and simmered for a while and they're like, you know what, maybe I don't feel comfortable with the decision I made. This came out right away and pushed McNamara to try for a new trial. And a 3-page affidavit was handed over from Harry Herman that supported the fact that the jury had been swayed. The juror claimed that the bailiffs, who, by the way, one of them was a deputy that had worked the case and the other was Sheriff Utzi's wife, so there is an interesting connection for you there. He claimed that they had made guilt comments 10 to 12 times during the trial to the jury, basically saying, we believe he's guilty, this is why we think he's guilty, and those are things that are not appropriate to say to a jury. They are supposed to make up their own opinion without bias, just listening to the evidence that is presented to them. There were also accusations that despite the judge's strong comments that you can see all over the media, quotes taken from him about keeping the jury segregated, keeping them away from the community, keeping them away from media sources. The juror claimed that that did not at all happen. It was said that the jurors were actually held on a hotel floor with multiple other people. They did not get their own hotel floor like you would typically see in a case this big. And so they were constantly around other people. And on top of that, he claimed that they were all able to read the newspaper, including what was being reported on the trial. And these are some pretty serious accusations. But interestingly, other jurors came forward and said, he's not being honest. Like, this is not at all how this actually went down. We didn't see any of this happening. And so it's like, okay, well then what is the truth here? Who is being honest? And McNamara wasn't only focusing on the jury and the fact that the jury had potentially been swayed, but also focused on Deputy Dummett and the fact that he had straight up perjured himself on the stand and nothing was being done about it. But despite that, all of this was thrown out and denied. There would be no new trial for Chester Weger. So while Mildred, Frances, and Lillian's families tried so hard to push forward, heal to whatever extent was possible, find some sort of peace knowing that Chester was locked up, Chester maintained his innocence and continued his fight. And at this point, an even harsher line was drawn in the sand. Community that began to rally around him. It seemed like it was a 50-50 split. People worried that the real killer had been entirely missed, and seeing that there were inconsistencies within the case and there was a big lack of physical evidence, and there were a lot of people just not at all convinced he was responsible. Equally, there were just as many people that were adamant that Chester remain in prison, that he never be released, that they did not want this sort of horror released back on their streets again. The jury were the ones trusted with this decision, and this was the decision that they made. 60 years passed, and during this time, there was a documentary made by Rakulia's son questioning the investigation and the outcome. He grew up surrounded by these stories about how his dad prosecuted Chester Weger. This was his dad's first big trial, first murder case, and he was questioning a lot of the information once he got older. This documentary went on for like 20 years before it was finally released a few years ago. And what spurred these deeper questions and this documentary by Rakulia's son was actually Donna Kelly. She was an attorney that was trying for Chester's clemency and seemingly brought forward a ton of information that threw everything everyone thought they knew into question, and she even brought forward someone that she believed could potentially be responsible. And that name was George Spiros, the son of Nick Spiros, who was the owner of the Starved Rock Lodge. And interestingly, days after she released this name, George Spiros was found after ending his own life, which could totally be unrelated, and we will dive into in the next video, but also just fanned the fire that seemed to be growing in regards to Chester's possible innocence. Also during this time, Chester was denied parole over 20 times until finally in 2020 when it was granted at 80-something years old. And even after all this time, the families of the women fought so hard, fought to keep Chester in jail. They showed up to every single parole hearing, wrote letters, went through every emotion, reopened every wound. Even family members who had never had the pleasure of meeting any of these women fought for Lillian, Frances, and Mildred. But Chester was ultimately free, and he was still fighting for his innocence over that entire time he had been fighting. And the difference between 1960 and now is technology, advancements in science, forensic testing, and this could open potentially so many doors. And back when they fought for clemency in 2004 and 2005, Donna Kelly had been told all of the evidence was bad, that it all had been contaminated, it had gone through too many hands, but just this year, they managed to get their hands on some evidence. Andy Hale, who is currently Chester's attorney, fought to try to use DNA testing on the hair found on Miss Murphy's glove. Again, if you remember, the two kinds of hair were some of the biggest pieces of evidence that seemed to suggest two people were involved. And it turns out that one of those hairs was actually compared against Chester years ago in 1960. The results actually came back just after he confessed. And guess what? The hairs were dissimilar. And so that hair was then taken through DNA testing with our current technology, and it was announced that this hair was not a DNA match to Chester. It was a DNA profile of an unidentified male. And not just that, this hair had never been introduced to evidence. The prosecution knew they had these tests that said that this hair was dissimilar to Chester's, and that would throw in reasonable doubt. And back in 1960, there was absolutely no legal obligation for prosecution to hand over any sort of possible exculpatory evidence. I believe that precedence finally went into place in like 64 or 65 or something. So that piece of evidence alone likely could have drastically changed this trial, and they weren't aware it existed. This opened the can of worms even bigger all these decades later, suggesting the possibility that this entire time they had the wrong man, or at the very least, someone else was potentially involved and they had no idea who it was.